Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with No-Knead Country Bread. That's right, this delicious and gorgeous loaf is part bread recipe, part science experiment, and part fun family project when you're all stuck in the house together looking for things to do. And while this procedure is very simple, it does take about 24 hours to do start to finish. So if you want this today, make sure you start it yesterday. And what we'll want to do first is add some flour to a large mixing bowl. And I'm going to be using two kinds. Okay, I'm going to start with some bread flour, although regular all-purpose flour will work. And then I'm also going to add a little bit of whole wheat flour, which in my case is going to be some sprouted spelt flour, which is by far my favorite whole grain flour to bake with. And then to our flours we will add a little bit of dry active yeast. And I mean a little bit. Okay, a no-knead bread recipe only needs about a quarter teaspoon of yeast. And since apparently there's a big yeast shortage going on, that is some good news. And then what we'll do is give that a quick stir with a wooden spoon before we stir in 2 cups of cold water. And I know we usually use warm water when we make bread, but with this, because we're going to let it rise for such a long time, some cold fresh water from the tap actually works out better. And what we want to do here is stir this with the wooden spoon for about 3 minutes until a very wet, extremely sticky dough forms. And then once that's been accomplished, we'll go ahead and add the last ingredient, which will be some kosher salt, or sea salt, or any salt that doesn't have any additives. And that's it. We'll go ahead and give that another stir for another 2 minutes or so, at which point, believe it or not, our dough will be done. And by the way, there's actually 2 reasons we don't have to knead this. First of all, we can't. Right, this is way too wet and sticky to work with our hands. And then secondly, we don't have to rely on kneading to build gluten, because when you let a dough ferment and rise for a very long time, it actually develops gluten all on its own, which is nice. But anyway, what we'll do once our salt's been mixed in is simply wrap this in foil and let it sit out at room temp for about 18 hours. All right, give or take. Which is why I generally like to start this in the afternoon sometime, so we can bake it up sometime in the afternoon the next day. So like I said, we'll go ahead and cover that and let it sit for 18 hours. At which point, if everything's gone according to plan, it should look something like this. Oh yeah, that is looking good, and very bubbly, but more like a scientific experiment than a bread dough. But that's okay, because just watch. And at this point, we'll go ahead and take a spatula, and we will deflate this by scraping down the sides, after which we'll kind of slide our spatula underneath, and fold the dough over the top of itself like this. Okay, sort of turning the bowl like this as we go. And besides deflating and degassing the dough, we're also giving all that gluten that developed a nice stretch. And that's it. Once we've done that about a dozen times or so, we will go ahead and scrape this extremely soft and sticky dough onto a well-floured surface. Okay, be very generous with the flour. And we will also want to sprinkle some over the top. And it might look like we have a little too much on the table, but we're going to use a lot of that on our hands as we do the next step, which is somehow, some way, form this into a loaf shape. And initially we're just sort of slapping it back and forth, trying to get it to release from the table. And then once it does, we'll use a combination of rolling and folding and turning and tucking until we have the dough formed into some kind of uniform shape. And while you're doing this, make sure you keep your hands well floured. And by the way, the shape does not matter, right? It could be round, it could be oval. But what does matter is that you end up with a nice smooth skin over the surface. And really, once you achieve that, you should just stop, which is not easy because this feels really, really good. Right, you'll see. And then what we'll do once we are happy with our shape and we have a nice smooth surface is transfer this onto a Silpat line baking sheet. Or if you don't have one of those, you can sprinkle down a whole bunch of cornmeal. And once our dough is panned up, we can do a little fine tuning, but not too much. All right, we want to make sure this looks homemade. And in fact, that's why we call it country bread, so that it doesn't really matter what it looks like. Okay, us country folks just want to eat some bread. We're not trying to impress anyone with a perfect loaf. That's what French bakeries in the city are for. But anyway, once we've formed our loaf and it's on a pan, what we'll do is let this rest somewhere uncovered for 2 hours, or until it doubles in size. And personally, my favorite spot would be inside a turned-off oven. But no matter where you leave yours, about 2 hours later it should look something like this. And it will have approximately doubled in size. Although because our dough is so wet, most of that's going to happen outward as opposed to upward. And then at this point we will do 2 things, one of which is optional. We will preheat our oven to 450. And then if we want, we will make 1 slash down the center with a very, very, very sharp knife or a razor. And sometimes I do this and sometimes I don't. It depends on my mood. So I'll let you decide. I mean, you are, after all, the Steve Nash of whether to slash. Man, I miss basketball. And by the way, the main reason for the slash is simply to prevent random ruptures in the crust and other spots. right? So it's really just an appearance thing. And then before this goes in the oven, if you have a spray bottle, I like to give the dough a light misting with water, which is going to help it develop an even more beautiful crust. But that is also optional, and it's going to look great even if we don't do this. And that's it. Our pan is now ready to transfer into the center of a 450-degree oven for about 30 minutes, or until beautifully browned and looking like this. Oh yeah, that does look like it came from some artisan bakery. But it didn't. You made that. And you can always test this with a thermometer, but the old school way to tell if this is done is by giving it the old tap-a-tap. And if it sounds like that, it's probably done. All right, it will have a nice hollow sound. And that's it. All we have to do is transfer that onto a rack to cool, and cool completely. Okay, if you slice into really hot bread, you're going to lose moisture and it's going to dry out. Although off the record, if it's still a little bit warm, you can probably get away with it. And fair warning, as this cools, it's going to contract and it's going to get bumpy. But that's okay because those bumps are from bubbles. And it's the bubbles that make the bread. As you'll see here as I slice in. And that was looking just about perfect. In fact, let me go to a tighter shot so you can see. And even though it takes many, many hours, by using this no-knead method with such a wet dough, the texture you're going to get here is just incredible. Okay, that outside is going to feature the perfect amount of crustiness, and the inside will be wonderfully light, with just the right amount of chewiness. And yes, spreading on some butter is highly recommended. So I finished that end piece and cut another slice. And of course, you're not supposed to slice on your marble slab with your nice serrated knife. But since the bread is the same color as my wooden cutting board, it just doesn't look as good. So I took one for the team. And not only does this super easy no-knead technique produce a great texture, but in general, breads that have a long fermentation time always seem to have a better flavor. Oh, and I should mention, if this looks familiar, give or take a little bit of olive oil and a slightly different technique, this is pretty much the same as our ciabatta bread. In fact, if you shape this into a rectangle, that's what you can call it. But anyway, for a little bit of dessert, I'm going to spread some jam on this last piece. And as I ate that, I couldn't help but wonder about all the people that have no idea just how simple it is to make bread. I mean, it's just mixing up some water and flour with a little bit of yeast and a touch of salt. And then a day later, with a very small amount of effort, you have this. Which is why I really do hope you give this a try soon. And also, share this with those people I was just referring to. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.